5 survival moments, 5 situations where American soldiers in Vietnam faced odds so insurmountable that survival itself became the mission, not victory. These aren't the sanitized stories you learned in high school history class. These are the raw, unfiltered accounts that veterans requested we cover, the moments they still wake up remembering 50 years later. What you're about to hear isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be. This is about young men, average age 19, thrust into situations where every instinct screamed to run. But duty demanded they stay. Where the jungle itself became the enemy. Where friends died in ways that defied comprehension. And where coming home alive was never guaranteed. If you think you know Vietnam, you know the Hollywood version. If you're here to actually understand what these soldiers endured, what survival meant when everything was designed to kill you, then you're in the right place. These stories matter because 58 never made it home. Millions more came back carrying memories that never fade. This is what survival looked like when the odds were impossible. Let's get into it. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict American forces had fought before. Between 1965 and 1973, over 2.7 million American service members deployed to a jungle battlefield where traditional tactics failed, where the enemy controlled the terrain, and where survival often depended on split-second decisions made by teenagers barely out of high school. Declassified military reports and decades of veteran testimony reveal something historians rarely emphasize. Vietnam wasn't just brutal because of combat intensity. It was brutal because soldiers faced threats from every direction simultaneously. The jungle concealed enemies who knew every trail. The weather could kill as efficiently as bullets. And perhaps most terrifying, American soldiers often couldn't tell friend from foe among the local population. Military psychiatric studies, conducted in the decades following Vietnam, identified specific survival scenarios that produced the highest rates of long-term psychological trauma. These weren't just difficult moments. They were situations where soldiers faced the absolute limits of human endurance, where survival required choices that would haunt them forever. The 5 worst survival moments we're covering today represent different dimensions of Vietnam's horror: ambush, isolation, environmental threat, moral impossibility, and inescapable terror. Each one reveals why Vietnam veterans describe their war differently than veterans of any other American conflict. Each one shows what it meant to survive when survival itself seemed impossible. Understanding these moments isn't just about history. It's about recognizing what we asked of an entire generation. The first worst survival moment was finding yourself in an ambush kill zone, a pre-planned trap where the enemy held every advantage, and escape meant running through a wall of bullets. The bitter irony? American forces were often ambushed while conducting search and destroy missions, meaning soldiers hunting the enemy suddenly became the hunted. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear that defined the Vietnam experience. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong perfected the L-shaped ambush to devastating effect. They'd position forces in 2 lines, forming an L, with the killing zone at the intersection. When an American patrol entered this zone, typically on a jungle trail only 3 prior 4 feet wide, gunfire erupted from 2 directions simultaneously. The front element would be caught in crossfire, while the rear couldn't advance without running into their own men. Military records show that in a properly executed L-shaped ambush, enemy forces achieved casualty rates exceeding 70% in the first 30 seconds. One infantry lieutenant described in documented testimony, "You couldn't see them, couldn't return effective fire, and couldn't move. You just watched your men get cut down, and there was nothing you could do about it." What made these ambushes absolutely devastating was the combination of explosives and automatic weapons fire. The enemy would place claymore mines facing into the kill zone, each one projecting 700 steel balls across a 60-degree arc at lethal velocity. The moment American soldiers hit the trigger wire or came into the kill zone, these mines detonated first. Then came the AK-47 fire, RPG rounds, and mortars. Veterans consistently described the sound as apocalyptic. A wall of noise so loud that shouted orders couldn't be heard 3 feet away. The mines alone could wound or kill 15-20 soldiers in the initial blast. One sergeant stated in an oral history interview, "The claymores went off and suddenly half my squad was on the ground screaming. We hadn't fired a single shot, and we were already losing." Here's where survival became a moral nightmare. Military doctrine said you assault into an ambush, charging the enemy position to break their advantage. But charging into interlocking fields of fire, through jungle so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, meant certain death for whoever led the assault. Yet staying in the kill zone meant everyone died. And withdrawing? That meant leaving wounded soldiers behind, something that violated the most sacred principle of American military culture. Platoon leaders, often 22-year-old second lieutenants on their first deployment, had to make this decision while bullets cut through the vegetation around them. The psychological weight was crushing. According to military psychiatrists who studied Vietnam veterans, making this choice under fire, whatever the outcome, produced trauma that persisted for decades. One medic recalled, "My lieutenant froze, just completely locked up. So we started dragging the wounded back ourselves, and more guys got hit doing it. There was no right answer. If you survived the initial ambush and established a defensive perimeter, survival now depended on medevac helicopters arriving before you bled out, or the enemy overran your position. The average response time for a dust-off, medical evacuation helicopter, was 30 minutes in the Vietnamese highlands, but those 30 minutes felt like hours. You'd be defending a shrinking perimeter, ammunition running low, watching wounded soldiers deteriorate, while calling in artillery danger close, meaning shells landing within 600 meters of your own position. The sounds still haunt veterans, wounded screaming for morphine, officers calling coordinates over the radio with forced calm, the distant thump of rotor blades that might arrive too late. One crew chief described in documented testimony, "We'd come in under fire, rotors getting hit, and soldiers would be throwing their buddies onto the helicopter. Some were already dead, but they threw them on anyway. Nobody got left behind if we could help it." The second worst survival moment involved isolation deep in the jungle with no support available. The second worst survival moment came when soldiers found themselves isolated from their unit, alone or in small groups, deep in hostile jungle with no way to call for help. The Vietnamese jungle wasn't just a battlefield. It was an active threat, designed to kill through heat, disease, and sheer disorientation. Survival meant enduring not just enemy soldiers, but an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. Vietnam's triple-canopy jungle created a 3-layered ceiling of vegetation so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground level. This meant soldiers couldn't use the sun for navigation. It meant radio signals often couldn't reach base camps just 3 miles away. It meant helicopter extraction became nearly impossible because pilots couldn't see the ground. Military studies showed that without constant compass checks, soldiers would drift in circles, sometimes passing the same landmark multiple times without realizing it. One reconnaissance specialist stated in a documented interview, I got separated from my squad during a firefight, ran into the jungle, and just kept running. When I stopped, I realized I had no idea which direction I'd come from. The jungle all looked the same. Every direction was just more green. Soldiers isolated in this environment faced a grim calculus. Stay still and hope for rescue, or move and possibly get more lost, while increasing the chance of walking into an enemy position. Beyond enemy soldiers, the jungle itself was trying to kill you through disease. Mosquitoes in Vietnam carried multiple strains of malaria, some resistant to the chloroquine tablets issued to American troops. According to military medical records, approximately 40,000 American soldiers contracted malaria during the war, with some strains causing death within 72 hours if untreated. But it wasn't just malaria. There was dengue fever, causing bone-breaking pain, dysentery from contaminated water, jungle rot that ate through skin on feet that stayed wet for days. One medic described in testimony, "You'd see guys isolated for 3 or 4 days, and when we found them, their feet would be white and swollen, skin peeling off in sheets. The smell was like rotting meat. Some lost toes to infection." For a soldier alone in the jungle, every mosquito bite became a potential death sentence. Every stream offered water you desperately needed, but knew could make you violently ill. Survival meant choosing between immediate threats and delayed ones. American soldiers quickly learned that the jungle contained predators beyond human enemies. Bengal tigers still roamed the Vietnamese highlands, and they occasionally attacked isolated soldiers. More commonly, soldiers encountered bamboo vipers, kraits, and king cobras, snakes whose venom could kill within hours. One infantry sergeant stated in an oral history, "I was hiding in thick brush, waiting for dawn so I could figure out where I was. Something brushed against my leg. I looked down and there was a snake thick as my arm, maybe 6 feet long, sliding over my boot. I didn't breathe, didn't move. If it bit me out there alone, I was dead." Veterans described this as a uniquely terrifying experience because it activated primal fears, separate from combat. You'd survived firefights, ambushes, and booby traps. But a snake? That was different. That was nature itself rejecting your presence. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers realized that even if the enemy didn't kill them, the jungle offered dozens of other ways to die. American soldiers carried roughly 3 days of rations and 2 canteens of water into the jungle. If you were isolated longer than that, you faced starvation and deadly dehydration in the Vietnamese heat, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees with 90% humidity. Declassified after-action reports document cases of soldiers drinking from streams, despite knowing the risks, consuming rainwater from leaves, even eating insects to survive. One soldier rescued after 6 days described the experience. "By day 4, I would have surrendered to the NVA just for water. I was hallucinating, hearing voices. I knew if I drank from the stream, I'd probably get dysentery, but I drank anyway, because dying of thirst seemed worse." The human body can survive 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. In Vietnam's heat, that timeline compressed to perhaps 48 hours before cognitive function deteriorated. Isolated soldiers had to decide, risk the water and possibly survive, or maintain discipline and definitely die. The third worst survival moment involved threats you couldn't see or hear until they were already killing you. The third worst survival moment centered on invisible threats, booby traps, mines, and punji stakes that could kill or maim without warning, without an enemy soldier present, and without any chance to fight back. The psychological toll of walking through a landscape where every step might be your last fundamentally changed how soldiers moved through the world. Let's break down why this created such profound and lasting trauma. Punji pits represented warfare at its most primitive and effective. The Viet Cong would dig a pit roughly 3 feet deep, fill it with sharpened bamboo stakes, often coated with human feces to cause infection, then cover it with vegetation and dirt to make it invisible. A soldier's weight would break through the cover, impaling their leg on multiple stakes. Military medical reports documented over 2,000 punji stake injuries during the war. What made these weapons psychologically devastating wasn't just the injury, it was the intimate cruelty. Someone had carefully constructed this trap, knowing it would maim whoever triggered it. One infantry soldier described in documented testimony, "My point man stepped on one. He went through the cover, and we heard him scream. When we pulled him out, there were 6 stakes through his leg and foot. The bamboo had barbs carved into it, so it shredded the tissue coming out. He was crying, saying his leg was on fire. The feces caused infection so bad they had to amputate below the knee." Beyond punji stakes, American soldiers faced numerous mine types designed to maim rather than kill. The M14 toe popper required only 20 pounds of pressure to detonate, meaning a single misstep would blow off a soldier's foot. The S-mine, called the Bouncing Betty by Americans, was even more terrifying. When triggered, it launched 3 to 4 feet into the air before exploding, sending shrapnel into the chest and face of everyone within 30 feet. Veterans consistently described the specific fear these created. You could survive the explosion and watch your friends die, or you could die and your friends would have to collect what remained. According to military records, mines and booby traps accounted for approximately 11% of American combat deaths and 17% of injuries, which meant roughly 1 in 6 soldiers evacuated from Vietnam had stepped on something they never saw. One platoon sergeant stated in an oral history interview, "You'd watch the ground constantly, every leaf, every disturbance in the dirt. But in jungle that dense, you couldn't see everything, so you just prayed. You prayed every single step." Here's what made this survival challenge uniquely destructive. It eliminated the concept of safe movement. In a conventional war, there are front lines, rear areas, safe zones. In Vietnam, there was no safe ground. Documented incidents include mines found inside American base perimeters, placed there by enemy sappers, or even by Vietnamese civilians working on the base. Veterans describe developing hypervigilance that never turned off, constantly scanning the ground, tensing at every uneven surface, unable to walk naturally. One corporal described in testimony, "I walked point for 7 months. Every step, I was looking for disturbances, tripwires, discolored dirt. I came home and couldn't walk down my own street without watching the ground. My wife thought I was crazy, but I'd seen what happened when you didn't watch." Military psychiatric research shows this hypervigilance often persisted for decades. Veterans would avoid walking on grass, refuse to let children play in yards, inspect parking lots before walking through them. The jungle had rewired their brains to treat all ground as potentially lethal. Walking point, the lead position in a patrol, meant you were most likely to trigger booby traps first. Military protocol rotated this duty, but that meant everyone knew their turn was coming. Point men carried the crushing responsibility of protecting their squad while knowing they'd probably be the first to die. The average life expectancy of a point man in heavy combat zones was estimated at just 2 weeks. One soldier who walked point for 6 months described the psychological burden. You're not just responsible for yourself. Every trap you don't spot could kill the guy behind you. So you move slow, check everything, and the squad gets frustrated because you're taking too long. But if you move fast and miss something, men die. That weight never leaves you, never. After-action reports documented numerous cases of soldiers suffering psychological breakdowns after their failure to detect a trap resulted in casualties. The guilt, combined with the constant threat, created trauma that often manifested as survivor's guilt and self-blame decades later. The fourth worst survival moment involved making impossible choices between following orders and personal survival. The fourth worst survival moment emerged when soldiers faced morally impossible situations, where survival meant compromising principles, where following orders conflicted with conscience, and where the distinction between combatant and civilian became fatally unclear. These weren't battlefield tactics. These were existential crises that forced soldiers to choose between their humanity and their duty. Let's break down why these situations produced trauma that outlasted physical wounds. Search and destroy missions typified Vietnam's moral complexity. Soldiers would enter villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong, tasked with finding weapons, supplies, or enemy fighters. But intelligence was often unreliable. Villages marked as hostile contained mostly women, children, and elderly. Meanwhile, actual Viet Cong often operated from villages that appeared peaceful. According to military reports, approximately 60% of search and destroy missions found no enemy forces. Yet these operations destroyed homes, displaced families, and created civilian casualties. One infantry lieutenant described in documented testimony, "We'd burn their hooches, kill their livestock, destroy their rice stores." Orders said the village was hostile, but all I saw were terrified farmers. How do you tell a 19-year-old kid from Iowa to burn down a grandmother's home? How does that kid live with that after? Soldiers faced an impossible equation. Follow orders that might be based on false intelligence, or refuse and face court-martial. The psychological cost was profound because there was no right answer. Vietnamese forces sometimes used children as combatants, either voluntarily or through coercion. American soldiers encountered boys as young as 12 carrying weapons, planting mines, or acting as spotters for enemy forces. Military rules of engagement allowed soldiers to fire on anyone carrying a weapon, regardless of age. But actually pulling that trigger on a child? That destroyed something fundamental in many soldiers. One machine gunner stated in an oral history interview, "I saw a kid, maybe 13, maybe 14, running with an AK. He fired at us. I fired back. I killed him. That was 47 years ago. And I still see his face. I followed the rules. I protected my squad. And it doesn't matter. Nothing makes that okay." Veterans described these encounters as uniquely traumatic because they violated deeply held cultural prohibitions. After-action reports documented numerous instances of soldiers refusing to engage obvious threats because the threat was a child, resulting in American casualties. The psychological damage was unavoidable. Engage and live with killing a child, or don't engage and live with American deaths you could have prevented. Viet Cong and NVA forces understood American reluctance to harm civilians and exploited it ruthlessly. Declassified reports document numerous incidents where enemy forces forced civilians to walk ahead of their positions during advances or positioned firing positions inside civilian homes. American soldiers had to choose, return fire and cause civilian casualties, or hold fire and take casualties themselves. One squad leader described, in documented testimony, "We took fire from a hooch. I could see women and kids inside. The NVA were firing from behind them. I called in the location. Artillery hit it. When we swept through after, the civilians were dead too. I gave the order. That blood is on me." Military psychiatric studies identified this as a primary contributor to moral injury, a form of trauma distinct from PTSD. It wasn't fear-based. It was guilt-based, shame-based, a fundamental sense that you'd violated your own moral code even when following lawful orders. Many veterans described feeling they'd become the monsters they'd been sent to fight. When multiple soldiers were critically wounded simultaneously, and medevac helicopters had limited space, medics and commanding officers had to perform triage, deciding who got evacuated first. This meant deciding who lived and who died. Military medical doctrine provided guidelines. Treat the most salvageable first, which often meant leaving the most critically wounded behind. One combat medic described this burden in searing detail. "I had 3 guys critically wounded. The dust-off had room for 2. I had to choose. I picked the 2 I thought could survive. The third died waiting for the next helicopter. His mother sent me a letter after the war. She found my name in his effects. She wanted to know if he died quickly. What do you tell her? That he died because I made a calculation? That math doesn't work with human lives." Veterans who made these triage decisions often carried crushing guilt, constantly replaying the decision, wondering if they'd chosen correctly, unable to forgive themselves even when military doctrine supported their choice. This wasn't about enemy action. This was about surviving the weight of playing God. The 5th worst survival moment involved a threat you couldn't escape, no matter what you did. The 5th, and perhaps most psychologically devastating survival moment, came from threats that existed everywhere simultaneously, that you couldn't prepare for, couldn't defend against, and couldn't escape. This was the ultimate nightmare. Understanding that survival was partially random, that doing everything right might still result in death, and that safety existed nowhere. Let's break down why this created such profound helplessness. American soldiers believed that while combat patrols were dangerous, returning to base meant relative safety. They were wrong. Viet Cong and NVA forces regularly launched rocket and mortar attacks on American bases, often at night when soldiers were sleeping. These attacks came without warning, giving soldiers perhaps 15-20 seconds from first launch to impact. According to military records, during the 1968 Tet Offensive alone, over 150 American installations came under simultaneous rocket and mortar attack, resulting in 1,136 American deaths and 7,764 wounded, many killed in their bunks or while running for shelters. One soldier described in documented testimony, "You'd hear the whistle of incoming, that distinctive shriek, and you'd just run. Didn't matter where. You couldn't see the rounds, couldn't shoot back, couldn't do anything except run and hope. I saw a guy get hit right outside the bunker door. 3 feet from safety. The randomness of it destroyed any sense of control we had. The Soviet-made 122mm rocket was particularly feared because of its range and payload. These rockets could be launched from up to 11 kilometers away, far beyond the range of American counter-battery fire. Each rocket carried 42 pounds of high explosive and produced a kill radius of approximately 30 meters. The Viet Cong would set them up on crude wooden frames, point them at American bases using rudimentary aiming, then launch multiple rockets in quick succession before fleeing. The rockets were wildly inaccurate, which somehow made them more terrifying. You couldn't predict impact points. One might hit the motor pool, the next might hit the hospital tent, the third might hit nothing. Veterans consistently describe the psychological toll. We called them 122 lullabies because they'd come at night. You'd be sleeping, and suddenly the whole base erupted. Explosions everywhere. Screaming. You'd huddle in your bunker and just wait for it to be over. Some guys got hit 6 or 7 times over their tour. How do you sleep after that? You don't. One sergeant stated in testimony that after his 3rd rocket attack, he stopped sleeping entirely for 4 consecutive days, staying awake through sheer terror and amphetamines. According to Department of Defense records, approximately 8,000 American casualties in Vietnam resulted from friendly fire, roughly 15% of all combat deaths. These included misdirected artillery strikes, close air support landing on American positions, helicopter gunships engaging friendly forces, and confused firefights where American units shot at each other in thick jungle. The psychological impact was catastrophic because it eliminated trust in your own support systems. One forward observer described in an oral history interview, "I called in an artillery strike, gave them the coordinates 3 times. The rounds landed 400 meters off target, right on our position, killed 6 of my guys. The lieutenant was screaming at me like I'd murdered them. I checked my coordinates 50 times after. They were right, but it didn't matter. Those men died because of artillery that was supposed to protect us." Veterans who survived friendly fire incidents often developed paralyzing distrust of command, refused to call in fire support even when desperately needed, and carried guilt as profound as if they'd pulled the trigger themselves. This wasn't enemy action. This was death from forces meant to keep you alive. Helicopters were simultaneously the symbol of American technological superiority and a major cause of non-combat deaths. According to military records, approximately 12,000 helicopters were used in Vietnam, and roughly 5,000 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Over 2,000 American service members died in helicopter crashes not related to enemy fire, including mechanical failures, pilot error, and weather-related accidents. The psychological terror came from dependence. Helicopters were your only way in or out of combat zones. When you were wounded, the sound of rotor blades meant salvation. But veterans learned that entering a helicopter meant trusting your life to machinery that failed regularly, to pilots who were often exhausted and flying in impossible conditions. One medic described in documented testimony, "We loaded 8 wounded onto a Huey, standard medevac. The helicopter lifted off and got maybe 200 feet up. The rotor just stopped. The whole thing dropped like a stone, exploded on impact. Everyone died, including the crew. We'd gotten them to safety, and they died anyway. How do you process that?" For soldiers who witnessed multiple helicopter crashes, the sound of rotor blades created immediate anxiety rather than relief. Salvation and death became indistinguishable. What connects all five of these worst survival moments is a single, devastating reality. In Vietnam, there was no safe place, no safe choice, and no guarantee that training, discipline, or courage would keep you alive. Unlike conventional warfare with front lines and rear areas, Vietnam eliminated the concept of sanctuary. The jungle was hostile. The bases were vulnerable. The villages were dangerous. Even your own weapons systems could kill you. Military psychiatric research conducted over decades following Vietnam identified these scenarios as primary contributors to what was then called post-Vietnam syndrome, later recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Studies showed that Vietnam veterans experienced PTSD at rates exceeding 30%, compared to roughly 12% for World War II veterans. The difference wasn't courage or toughness. The difference was the nature of survival in Vietnam. When you survived an ambush, you didn't feel victorious. You felt lucky, and you knew your luck would eventually run out. When you survived isolation, you returned to your unit, knowing you could be isolated again tomorrow. When you survived booby traps, you knew the next step might be your last. When you made impossible moral choices, you survived physically, but something inside died. And when you survived the inescapable threats, you learned that survival itself was partially random, that doing everything right still might not be enough. This psychological reality created lasting damage that statistics barely capture. Of the 2.7 million Americans who served in Vietnam, approximately 58,220 died during the war. But the casualties didn't stop in 1973. Studies estimate that over 200,000 Vietnam veterans have died by suicide since returning home, a number nearly 4 times the combat death toll. Veterans Affairs data shows Vietnam veterans continue to experience PTSD, depression, and substance abuse at rates significantly higher than the general population, even 50 years after the war's end. These weren't just soldiers. They were young men, average age 19, who volunteered or were drafted into a war that asked them to survive the unsurvivable. They were sons and brothers, many of whom never fully came home, even when their bodies did. They were an entire generation that carried the weight of impossible choices, random death, and moral complexity that defied easy answers. The 5 worst survival moments we've covered: the ambush kill zone, isolation in hostile jungle, invisible threats that struck without warning, morally impossible choices, and inescapable dangers that existed everywhere. These weren't just difficult experiences. They were existential challenges that fundamentally changed how these soldiers understood safety, trust, morality, and their place in the world. Over 3 million Vietnamese also died. Families were shattered across an entire region, and the war's legacy continues to shape both nations. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Thank you for enduring what should never have been asked of anyone. If you have stories you're willing to share, perspectives that add to this history, please share them in the comments below. These accounts matter. Your experiences matter. For everyone else, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this content. This is history that goes beyond sanitized textbooks. History that honors what was actually endured. The more people who understand what Vietnam really meant, the better we can serve those who survived it, and remember those who didn't. Remember what was asked of these soldiers. Remember the cost of their survival. Thank you for watching.